what actually happens inside your mind and body when you are pushed to the absolute limit, facing, lethal danger. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the mysterious science of extreme fear.
It's one of the most intense human experiences, definitely, and something that has fascinated people for, well, forever, really. It brings up those incredible stories.
Yeah, the ones where someone does something seemingly impossible under just immense pressure.
Exactly.
And this deep dive, it's based on a fascinating exploration into the science behind those moments, drawing on some really remarkable accounts.
Hmm.
Think about British pilot Neil Williams back in 1970. He landed his plane after the wing fell off, performing complex maneuvers. I mean, how is that even possible?
That sounds incredible, doesn't it? Or Tom Boyle Jr., who found this almost uncanny strength after a car crash to lift wreckage off his trapped wife.
Wow.
And these aren't just, isolated incidents. History is full of people who somehow managed to think clearly and act decisively when everything was absolutely on the line.
But then there's the other side of it, right? When fear completely takes over, leading people to freeze up or just kind of lose it.
That's the paradox.
So our mission today is to unpack this mystery. We'll explore both the surprising ways fear can, give you an edge, those moments that feel almost superhuman, and the terrifying ways it can cause total collapse.
And crucially, what we can actually learn from all this science.
Exactly. Where do we start? The brain, I assume.
Yeah, to really understand this, we need to start with the brain's fundamental architecture for dealing with threats. So, deep within the brain, below the conscious thinking layers,
Yeah.
you've got the ancient limbic system.
Older, more primitive part.
That's right. This area handles core processes like emotion, memory, the basics.
And within that limbic system, is there one part that's really central to that first initial threat response?
That would be the amygdala. It's a key center for evaluating incoming information for any signs of danger, and it operates incredibly fast.
Faster than we can consciously process.
Much faster. It's also crucial for forming emotional memories, often way below our conscious awareness.
So like Joseph Ledoux has suggested, is that potentially where some phobias might come from? Those really early non-conscious emotional associations formed way down there by the amygdala.
That's certainly a prominent theory, yeah.
Yeah.
That the amygdala can form these deeply ingrained fear memories very early on without you even knowing it.
Ah,
Now, to think about how conscious and automatic processes interact in these danger situations, psychologist Matthew Lieberman has a pretty helpful model, the X system and the C system.
okay, X and C, how do those work?
Okay, think of the X system as reflexive, automatic. It's fast, effortless, and runs completely outside your conscious awareness.
So like instincts, fight or flight.
That's part of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Instinctual fear responses.
Mm.
But also highly practiced learned behaviors like tying your shoes or riding a bike or even driving for experienced drivers, stuff you do without really thinking. It's super efficient.
Got it. And the C system.
That's your conscious deliberative system. It requires effort, conscious thought. It's what you use for planning, reasoning, solving new problems. And it's much, much slower than the X system.
So in extreme danger, the main idea is that the fear response is mostly an X system thing, a takeover.
Precisely. The brain's automatic threat response, driven mainly by the amygdala and related structures, operates incredibly fast. By the time your conscious brain, the C system, the cortex, has even fully registered, oh, that's a threat, the amygdala may have already triggered automatic behaviors through the X system.
That speed is crucial for survival then.
Absolutely. In immediate danger, milliseconds count.
Which brings us to those surprising ways fear can sometimes give you an edge, the almost superhuman stuff. Samuel Johnson's quote comes to mind. When a man knows he is to be hanged in a fortnight, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. There's something to that fierce focus, isn't there?
There really is. Okay, maybe Johnson's example is a bit grim, but even less intense fear can dramatically sharpen focus. David Eagleman explains it well. Normally, your brain is juggling tons of things unconsciously.
Right, background noise.
Yeah. But when the amygdala detects a threat, it essentially sends this massive signal saying, okay, everyone shut up, pay attention now.
It just cuts through everything else.
Exactly. Non-essential processes get sidelined, directing maximum processing power to analyzing the threat and figuring out what to do. This heightened focus, partly fueled by the neurotransmitter noradrenaline, allows for surprisingly clear thinking, but about the immediate situation.
So that's why some people get laser focused before a deadline, even procrastinators.
Could be part of it, yeah. That pressure kicks the focus system into gear.
And you hear about athletes in really high-stakes moments being in the zone, like rock climbers, surfers. Dean Potter described his senses peaking when facing, a death consequence, seeing more clearly, thinking faster.
Hmm.
It's this weird paradox where it feels calm even though the danger is extreme.
That optimal arousal state, yeah, it can feel almost transcendent for some people. They're leveraging that heightened focus aspect of the fear response perfectly.
What about memory? Scary events. They often feel like they're burned into your memory with incredible detail, like you remember everything.
That's the flashbulb memory effect. And it makes sense, evolutionarily speaking. Emotionally charged events, especially fearful ones, are better remembered.
Why is that?
Well, nature wants to make sure you remember what the threat was, where it was, how you survived it, so you don't make the same mistake again. The hippocampus, which handles memory formation, seems to hold on to more impressions in greater detail during these high arousal states.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the time slowing down thing, that feels so real in those moments. Does your brain actually speed up? Are you perceiving things faster?
Okay, this one is really counterintuitive. It feels like time slows down. Absolutely. People consistently report that. But the studies suggest fear doesn't actually speed up your perception or your information processing speed.
Really? What about that experiment?
Yeah.
Dropping people?
Ah, yes, David Eagleman's SCAD tower experiment. That's key here. He had people free-falling, and they definitely reported time slowing down subjectively.
But there's always a but.
The but is he also gave them a special wristwatch displaying numbers flashing too fast to read normally. The idea was, if their perception actually sped up during the fall, they might be able to read the numbers.
And could they?
Nope. Still couldn't read it.
Huh. So what's going on then? If it feels slow motion but isn't?
The current thinking is that during a highly fearful event, your brain, especially the amygdala working with the hippocampus, lays down denser memories. You encode more details about the experience.
More data points per second? Kind of.
Sort of, yeah. And since our subjective sense of how much time has passed is partly based on the amount of memory, the number of distinct moments we recall from that period, while an event packed with more remembered detail feels longer when you look back on it.
Whoa. So that vivid slow motion feeling in the moment might actually be like a trick of memory. Something your brain constructs after the event based on how richly it was recorded. That's a really striking implication, isn't it? It definitely makes you question how accurately we perceive reality, especially when we're under extreme pressure. Our vivid present might be more of a vivid reconstruction.
Mind-bending. Okay, what about the strength aspect? Like Tom Boyle lifting that car wreckage? Does fear literally give you superhuman strength?
Well, fear definitely prepares the body for vigorous physical action. That's the sympathetic nervous system going into overdrive.
Adrenaline, cortisol.
Exactly. Your blood pressure surges, heart races, pumping oxygen and energy like crazy to your muscles. It's like flooring the accelerator in your car.
So you can access more strength than usual.
Yes. You can tap into more of your absolute maximum potential strength than you normally could in a calm state. Maybe around 35% more based on some estimates like Zatsiorsky's work. But
Another but.
the myth of suddenly being able to lift cars or perform feats that are physically impossible for you, that's mostly myth. Adrenaline lets you push closer to your existing physical limits. It doesn't suddenly grant you entirely new strength.
So Tom Boyle.
Tom Boyle was already an experienced weightlifter. The adrenaline surge likely gave him that critical extra push to access more of the strength he already possessed. It wasn't magic, it was physiology pushed to its edge.
Okay, so fear can give you focus, maybe warp time perception in retrospect, and unlock a bit more strength. That's the edge part. But there's definitely a dark side, right, when it just overwhelms.
Oh, absolutely. There's a point where the intensity tips over. Think of the Yerkes-Dodson curve. Performance increases with arousal up to a point, but then it crashes.
And as fear gets really intense?
Performance rapidly declines towards total incapacitation. You start seeing symptoms like uncontrollable trembling, profuse sweating, difficulty thinking clearly, an overwhelming urge to just run away, and this terrifying feeling of losing control completely.
And there are actual physical costs when you're in that extreme state, aren't there? It's not just in your head.
No, definitely not. It's the pay-the-piper effect. Your body drastically redirects energy away from anything deemed non-essential for immediate survival. Digestion shuts down, hence the dry mouth, sometimes nausea, vomiting, or even losing control of bladder or bowels.
That was noted in soldiers, right? WWII.
Yes, quite commonly reported among airmen under fire or soldiers in intense combat. Energy is even diverted away from the immune system long term. And those physical responses that help in moderate fear, like increased muscle tension, they become liabilities. That trembling is basically your muscles burning energy in rapid, useless contractions.
And that intense focus we talked about earlier, that can actually backfire too.
Hugely. It can devolve into what's called perceptual narrowing or tunnel vision. In moderate stress, you filter out distractions. In extreme stress, your focus tightens and tightens until you might ignore everything except the absolute pinpoint center of your attention.
Even critical information right next to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that can be deadly if the key to survival happens to be just outside that incredibly narrow field of view or awareness.
Is the Corey Lytle crash an example of this? The pilot in New York.
That's a tragic textbook example, yes. Lytle was a novice pilot, flying in very challenging conditions, basically threading a needle up the East River between skyscrapers. He was under intense pressure, intense time constraints, which are huge stressors themselves.
And contribute to cognitive shutdown.
Massively. So he needed to make a 180-degree turn in this narrow space. He seems to have pretty much. High levels of noradrenaline, acting on specific receptors like the A1 receptor, can effectively shut down the prefrontal cortex. That's your executive control center, conscious thought, planning, weighing options, flexible thinking.
So decision-making becomes
Rigid. Based on incomplete information, oversimplified assumptions. Working memory goes out the window. Anything requiring careful, deliberate thought becomes incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Time pressure just makes it all worse.
And the most extreme end of this is just total collapse.
Yeah, catastrophic collapse. That's where you see either abject hysteria, uncontrollable panic, or a kind of catatonic trance. People become completely immobile, unresponsive,
Frozen.
literally frozen. Rescue personnel sometimes report having to shout loudly, even shake people just to try and snap them out of it, to break through that profound psychic paralysis. It's been documented in soldiers freezing solid in the middle of battle.
What about that weird feeling some people describe, like watching yourself from a distance, like you're in a movie, detached?
Ah, that's dissociation. It's thought to be a kind of short-term coping mechanism. When the emotional overwhelm is just too intense, the mind creates this sense of detachment, feeling removed from your own body or the situation.
Like Jock Otter during his bear attack.
That's a classic description. He talked about feeling detached, observing himself methodically taking actions to survive, but not consciously feeling the terror during the attack itself. That often comes later in a huge wave once the immediate danger has passed.
So the conscious mind sort of checks out to protect itself.
That seems to be the idea. It's a way to function when the emotional input is just unbearable.
Okay, so beyond the C system shutting down, are there even deeper, more ancient responses that get triggered?
Yes. When danger is really intense, it activates these ancient hardwired structures way down in the brainstem. A key player here is the periaqueductal gray, or PEG.
The PEG, what does that do?
The PEG generates these very fixed stereotype behavioral responses to extreme threat. These are largely automatic, well outside our conscious control. Think of them as the brain's oldest emergency toolkit.
And these are things like freeze, flee.
Exactly. We often categorize them as freeze, flee, faint, and fight.
Let's quickly run through those. What's freeze?
Freeze is basically doing nothing, playing dead almost, hoping you won't be detected or that the threat will pass if you stay perfectly still.
Like a deer in headlights.
Precisely. Or think of young antelopes instinctively staying motionless in tall grass when a predator is near. It's not a rational choice. It's an automatic posture triggered by intense fear. Sue Yellowtail described this exact feeling when she suddenly encountered a mountain lion, just complete instinctive immobility.
Okay. Flee seems obvious, the urge to run.
Right, the instinct to escape danger. But it can be incredibly dangerous itself, especially in confined spaces or crowds.
Like stampedes.
Exactly. The tragic incident at Bethnal Green Underground Station during a WWII air raid in London is a horrific example. There wasn't even a direct bomb hit nearby, just the sound of anti-aircraft rockets firing.
And that caused panic.
A huge surge of panic towards the shelter stairs. Someone tripped near the bottom, and then hundreds of people fell on top of each other in the darkness. 173 people died in the crush. Just the perceived threat triggering an uncontrollable, fatal urge to flee in a dangerous environment.
God, that's awful. Okay, what's faint? Is that literally fainting?
It's more like a sudden immobility response, sometimes called quiescence. It's a paradoxical reaction where the body goes limp and still. One theory is that some predators might lose interest in prey that appears dead.
Like playing possum.
Kind of, yeah.
Huh.
David Livingstone famously described this when a lion attacked him. He said he felt no pain or terror, just a sort of dreaminess, and the lion eventually dropped him, maybe because he seemed lifeless. It seems to involve an overload of both the go, sympathetic, and stop, parasympathetic nervous systems. It's a terrifying state of paralysis.
And finally, fight. Is that just lashing out?
Under extreme sympathetic overdrive, the PEG can trigger totally uninhibited blind violence. It's aggression stripped of any conscious control or strategy.
Useful sometimes, maybe.
Potentially in a desperate last stand. But it's also reckless, mindless, and incredibly hard to switch off once that ancient system takes the reins. Some interpretations of historical accounts, like the biblical story of Joshua's army destroying everything and everyone in Jericho after capturing it, continuing the violence well past any tactical necessity, could be seen as reflecting this kind of unchecked, fear-fueled aggression.
Wow, these deep-seated reactions are powerful. Let's shift a bit and talk about some specific ways fear manifests more commonly, like panic attacks.
Right. Cindy Jacobs' experience, which is described in the source material, is pretty typical. They can seem to strike completely out of the blue, though often they're linked to accumulated, maybe unnoticed stress building up over time.
And the first one is often the worst.
Absolutely terrifying. Because it feels like you're having a heart attack or stroke, you feel like your own body is betraying you, and worse, that you're losing control of your own mind. It's profoundly destabilizing.
What's happening physiologically during an attack to create that intense feeling?
It's often a vicious feedback loop. It might start with something subtle, like slight hyperventilation due to underlying anxiety. This changes the carbon dioxide levels in your blood.
And your body notices that.
Yes, you have subconscious sensors for blood gas levels. They trigger the urge to breathe more intensely, maybe a feeling of breathlessness. Now, if you're already anxious, your conscious mind, the C system, misinterprets these purely physical sensations as evidence of imminent danger. I can't breathe. Something is terribly wrong.
So the brain sends danger signals.
Exactly. The prefrontal cortex basically screams danger down to the amygdala. The amygdala then ramps up the sympathetic nervous system response. Heart pounds faster, you feel dizzier, more breathless, which confirms the conscious mind's fear, which signals more danger to the amygdala.
And the cycle just spins out of control.
Precisely. It accelerates into that terrifying peak experience. The lack of an obvious external trigger for the first attack is key. It feels like the threat is internal, coming from your own mind or body failing.
Which shatters that basic sense of being in control.
Completely. For milder cases, sometimes just regaining a small sense of control, like knowing you're near an exit if you feel trapped, can be enough to interrupt that feedback loop and dial down the anxiety before it fully escalates.
Makes sense. What about social fears and phobias? They seem incredibly common, too.
They are, and they're very deeply rooted in our biology as social creatures. For most of human history, our survival depended heavily on our place within a social group, our status in the hierarchy.
So being rejected or judged was literally dangerous.
Potentially, yes. Exclusion could mean losing access to resources, protection, mates. So our brains evolved to treat social threats like disapproval, rejection, humiliation, almost like physical threats. The stress response is very similar.
And hormones like oxytocin play a role in that social bonding.
Yes, oxytocin is crucial for social bonding and trust. As seen in studies like Sisu Carter's work with voles, it helps regulate that social circuitry.
So something relatively mild like shy bladder syndrome, paresis, that's a form of this social anxiety.
Exactly. A specific, relatively mild social phobia, the fear of being unable to urinate when others might be nearby. Pathological social phobia, though, is much more severe and pervasive.
How does that manifest?
It involves this profound dread of social situations, especially ones where you might be scrutinized or judged, leading to avoidance and intense physical symptoms like palpitations, trembling, sweating, just from being the focus of attention.
And people with severe social phobia often read situations negatively.
Yes, as Randy McCabe points out, there's often a bias towards interpreting ambiguous social cues negatively. If someone doesn't say hello, the immediate assumption might be they don't like me, rather than maybe they're just busy or distracted. These social status monitoring circuits are working overtime and are hypersensitive.
And trying not to be anxious makes it worse.
That's the cruel paradox. The harder you try to control the fear and appear normal, the more self-conscious you become, and often the worse the symptoms get. People with social phobia often adopt an observer perspective, mentally stepping outside themselves to monitor how they're coming across, which ironically makes them seem less engaged and can put others off.
Which sounds related to choking in performance situations. Is that considered a type of social phobia too?
Yeah, technically it's often classified as a non-generalized social anxiety disorder.
Hmm.
It's very specific to performance situations where you're being observed or evaluated. It's crucial to understand it's not a character flaw, not a lack of willpower.
Like those famous examples, Steve Blass the pitcher, Mackie Sasser the catcher, Dan Jansen the speed skater. Their skills were totally fine in practice.
Exactly. They could perform perfectly well when alone. It was the pressure of being watched, the social evaluation, that triggered the sudden dramatic collapse in performance.
And the mechanism behind choking is fascinating. It's like the wrong brain system tries to take control.
That's the leading theory. Normally, highly practiced motor skills like pitching a baseball, throwing back to the pitcher, skating become automatic. They run smoothly and efficiently on the X system, involving areas like the ventral striatum.
Effortless, unconscious competence.
Right. But under intense performance pressure, social anxiety kicks in, and the conscious C system, the prefrontal cortex, tries to jump back in and actively control or monitor the well-learned skill. Okay, keep your elbow tucked, follow through.
Thinking too much.
Exactly. Deliberately thinking about the mechanics of an automatic skill disrupts the smooth, automatic execution. And trying not to mess up often makes it worse.
How so?
That triggers something called the ideomotor effect. Just thinking vividly about an undesired action, like don't double clutch the throw, can actually interfere with the desired motor program, making the error more likely. It leads to those jerky, hesitant, unnatural movements, sometimes called a double pull.
And it's typically a sudden collapse, right? Not just getting gradually worse.
Yes, choking is often characterized by a sudden, catastrophic breakdown in performance once a certain threshold of anxiety is crossed.
And stage fright. That sounds like perhaps the most extreme version of this performance anxiety.
It's certainly an incredibly intense form. People who experience severe stage fright, actors like Laurence Olivier, musicians like Sidney Fortner or Chris Wells, describe a level of terror equivalent to facing mortal danger.
Like what? What does it feel like?
Descriptions often include a sensation of free fall, a sudden, complete loss of awareness or control, difficulty breathing, tunnel vision, sometimes even total blackouts where they have no memory of the performance afterwards. It can be absolutely debilitating.
To the point where people seek ways to manage it, like self-medication.
Definitely. Historically, alcohol was probably the earliest go-to for Dutch courage, trying to dampen that fear response. And interestingly, some brain scan studies have actually shown reduced amygdala activation when intoxicated subjects look at fearful faces.
And more recently, things like beta blockers. Valium.
Yes. Olivier famously used Valium. Beta blockers became quite common, especially in fields like classical music, often used off-label. They don't necessarily reduce the subjective feeling of fear, but they block many of the peripheral physical symptoms, the racing heart, the trembling hands, the sweating. For musicians or surgeons, controlling those physical symptoms can be enough.
So, okay, we've painted a picture of how powerful and automatic these fear responses can be, from the subtle to the completely overwhelming. It raises the question, are we just helpless passengers when extreme fear hits?
Right.
Or are there ways to, hang on and navigate through it?
That's the critical question, isn't it? And the answer is no, we are definitely not entirely helpless. While the automatic X system is incredibly powerful and fast, we're not just puppets. The key lies in either training that X system directly so it responds more effectively, or finding ways for the conscious C system to influence its operation or regain some control.
Training seems like it would be absolutely fundamental.
It is. Training and overlearning are probably the single most important principles for building resilience to stress and fear. The idea is to practice essential skills so relentlessly that they become deeply ingrained automatic reflexes.
Like muscle memory, but for complex actions.
Exactly. Think about the Roman army. Their incredible success wasn't just about numbers. It was about relentless, meticulous, constant practice. Flavius Josephus wrote that their training exercises were like unbloody battles, and their actual battles were like bloody exercises. Sure. The skills were automatic.
So automatic they could function even under extreme duress, like that story of Rob Smithy drawing his pistol.
Right, the hatchet attack story. He drew and fired accurately before he was even consciously aware of what exactly was happening. That's the result of thousands upon thousands of repetitions, embedding the action so deeply in the X system that it bypasses conscious thought entirely. It's sometimes called expertise-induced amnesia. You perform flawlessly, but can't necessarily explain how step by step afterwards because you weren't consciously thinking about it.
So skills that still require conscious thought are the ones that fall apart first under pressure.
Generally, yes. Those automatic overlearned skills are much more resistant to all but the most blind, overwhelming panic.
Train until you don't have to think. What else helps build that resilience?
Habituation through realistic exposure. This means repeatedly exposing yourself to the stressful situation or realistic simulations of it to gradually reduce the fear response over time.
Getting used to it.
Pretty much. The Navy's USS Trayer simulator is a great example. It's this incredibly realistic mock-up of a ship designed to put recruits through high-stress combat scenarios, fires, flooding, attacks.
Based on real events.
Yes, drawing lessons from incidents like the attack on the USS Cole. The goal is to teach sailors to perform their duties correctly, even when they're scared, disoriented, and under immense pressure. They habituate to the stress.
And that study with the parachutists, didn't it show that the anticipation is often worse than the actual event?
Right, the classic study by Walter Fenz and Seymour Epstein. They measured physiological responses in novice and experienced parachutists. Novices showed peak anxiety well before the jump, during the anticipation phase. Experienced jumpers had learned to manage that anticipatory anxiety. Their peak fear occurred closer to the jump itself and was lower overall. Habituation helps you manage the uncertainty and fear before the event.
So combining training with realistic exposure seems key.
Yes, practicing the skills while under the kind of stress you'll actually face is particularly powerful. Like having golfers practice crucial putts with people watching, and maybe even heckling them. It helps inoculate against the pressure.
Confidence must play a role too, right? Believing you can handle it.
Absolutely. Self-efficacy, the belief in your own ability to handle challenges and succeed, is a huge factor in how well people perform under pressure. The Roman writer Vegetius noted that a soldier's courage is heightened by consciousness of his skill. Knowing you know what to do reduces fear.
And success breeds confidence.
It does. Each time you successfully navigate a challenging situation, it builds that belief for the next time. Dave Boone, mentioned in the source, felt his prior experience surviving a life-threatening situation helped him remain calm and methodical during a subsequent avalanche because he had proof he could handle extreme events.
What about just feeling like you have some control, even a little bit?
That makes a big difference. Lab experiments going back decades show that if people believe they have even a small amount of control over an unpleasant stimulus, like being able to press a button to reduce the intensity of a shock, their stress levels are significantly lower, even if they don't actually use the button much.
The perception of control matters.
Yes, but even more powerful than just feeling you have control is actively taking control by taking action. Doing something, anything, to improve your situation shifts your focus outward, away from monitoring your internal fear state.
Like soldiers firing back.
Right. Studies from WWI suggested soldiers who were forced to passively endure shelling were more psychologically vulnerable than those who could actively engage the enemy, even if just by firing their rifles. Taking action provides a sense of agency.
Can you use other emotions to kind of fight fire with fire? Like getting angry?
Yes, that's another interesting strategy. Remember how the brain systems work? One powerful X system process can sometimes override another. Anger or indignation can be surprisingly effective at overwhelming fear.
Anger is as good as courage.
Exactly. That old Welsh proverb captures it well. Anger can make you feel powerful, focused, and less vulnerable. Military leaders have known this for centuries, trying to whip up righteous anger in their troops before battle. Monique Mitchell-Turner's research confirms that anger tends to make people feel empowered and more optimistic about risks.
Can you deliberately use that?
Sometimes, yes. Stanley Rockman described helping an agoraphobic patient finally leave his home by getting him to focus on his indignation and anger at his condition, at how it was limiting his life. That anger helped him push through the fear.
Okay, so we've got training, exposure, confidence, control, action, even anger. What about using our conscious mind, the C system, more directly? Can we think our way out of fear?
To some extent, yes. That's where cognitive reappraisal comes in. This is basically using your conscious C system to deliberately reevaluate or reframe a threatening situation in a less negative, less threatening way. It's a cornerstone of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
So instead of thinking, this is a disaster, you think?
You might consciously reframe it as, this is a challenge, or this is difficult, but I have resources to cope. Mark Stahl's work showed that simply instructing people to view a stressful task as a challenge rather than a threat improved their physiological responses and performance.
So the conscious mind can actually talk back to the amygdala and calm it down.
It seems so. Brain imaging studies, like those by Kevin Oxner and Matthew Lieberman, have provided evidence for this. They've shown that specific parts of the prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, VLPFC, become active when people consciously try to reappraise negative stimuli.
And what happens in the amygdala?
When the VLPFC activates during reappraisal, activity in the amygdala tends to decrease. It suggests the conscious brain can exert some top-down control over the emotional centers. Interestingly, simply putting your feelings into words labeling the emotion also seems to activate the VLPFC and dampen the amygdala response.
Does that take effort?
Initially, yes, cognitive reappraisal requires conscious effort. But the hope is that with practice, like any skill, it can become more automatic, a habitual way of responding to stressors.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, fear is this incredibly complex, powerful, often automatic system. It can amplify our abilities in some really surprising ways, focus, memory encoding, but it can also lead to devastating collapse when it overwhelms us.
It's definitely not simple. Understanding the science behind all the brain systems like the amygdala and PEG, the X and C systems, the physical cascade, the hardwired behavioral patterns like freeze or flee, it doesn't eliminate fear, but it gives us a framework.
And tools.
Exactly. Tools like training, realistic exposure, building confidence, taking control, using reappraisal. These are strategies grounded in that science that can help us navigate fear more effectively to exert some influence
Right.
rather than just being completely swept away by it.
It really paints a much more nuanced picture than just fight or flight. And thinking back to that Eagleman experiment, that idea about time perception during fear, if our conscious experience of the present moment, that vivid slow motion feeling, might actually be a retrospective reconstruction based on how densely we recorded memories. Well, what does that really tell us about our perception of reality when we're under extreme pressure? Can we ever truly know what we are experiencing as we are experiencing it in those moments?
That's the lingering question, isn't it? A really provocative thought about the nature of consciousness itself under duress.